Let's take a look at Chisholm in some of the reading that you've had here recently. I want to talk a little bit about it because we've covered some of the earlier aspects of it, but I want to make certain that we cover a few of the other items that we have not covered to this time. If you take your textbook and turn to page 99, where Chisholm is dealing with a suffix conjugation / perfect with wow consecutive. Remember, the term that we're using in class is that is a wow correlative, not a wow consecutive. Consecutive means sequence of events in order. Wow correlative means there's a relationship between them, but they may not be in chronological or logical order. And so this is the wekatal form of the verb that he's talking about. He talks about the different uses of it. He talks about the objective indicative uses of a customary past, and then a characteristic or habitual present, and of a simple future. He reminds us once again, the tense or the time of the Hebrew verb is not reliant upon the form of the verb, but the context in which it is used. So that a perfect can be used in all three tenses. The perfect is not automatically a past tense. The same as an imperfect is not automatically a future or present tense. The same thing goes for the imperfect. We must determine whether it is past, present, or future by context and context alone. Then he moves to the subjective uses, the hypothetical and contingent uses, where it is used in some of the conditional clauses. And he throws in a term here that you may not have heard before that's found on page 100. Under number 4, hypothetical future, he says sometimes the perfect with wow consecutive appears in the protasis. Protasis is the if part of a conditional sentence. If you speak Hebrew, then you can read the Hebrew Bible. The if clause is the protasis. In Greek, pro means before. Tasis is from tasso, which means to arrange or to set or to place. And so it means placed before. The if clause comes first. The then clause is the apodosis. The apodosis is apo, apa, the Greek meaning from, and dosis, which is from didomi, which means to give, that which is given from. If I do something, then what is the given result from that? And that's why it's called the apodosis. You use those terms only for conditional sentences. You don't use those terms for other relationships within a sentence. He talks here not only about contingent future and hypothetical future, he talks about possibility. Who knows? God might turn and relent. How do we learn that? We learn it by context. It's a form of the mood. It tells you that this is contingent upon something else happening, and it's not certain. It's not a state of reality. It's not indicative mood. It is a subjunctive mood, and it's gained by context. It can be translated as obligation or even a command. The perfect with wow consecutive is often used with an imperatival force after an imperatival form. He gives the example of Genesis 45:9. We have another example in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. There we have, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, one Yahweh. And then it goes on to say what? And you shall love the Lord your God. We'ahavta. All right? It is a wow on a perfect. It's a wekatal. It's a wow correlative perfect. And remember here the way Chisholm talks about this, and I've talked with him about it, and he admits it's confusing and that he's perhaps not utilized the term exactly. He makes it sound as though the wow consecutive is just the wow itself. And that's not true at all. The wow consecutive, as he's talking about it, is the verb itself. That's why it's called wekatal. It's the wow plus the katal, the perfect, or a wayiktol. It's the way prefix conjugation there with a yiktol verb. And so we talk about wayiktol verbs, not wayiktol conjunctions. Okay? It's a wow consecutive verb, not a while consecutive conjunction. It's a while correlative verb, not a while correlative conjunction. And so watch that as he talks about it here, because the way he talks about it, as right here on page 101 under command, he talks about it as the perfect with a while consecutive, and actually it's a perfect in the form of the while consecutive is the way it should be, the way he should word it. And also keep in mind, again, we use while correlative for what he says while consecutive here for the perfect, because it has to do with logical relationship, not sequence or consecution of events. So the perfect can be used even as an imperative. These are the modal, the mood uses of the perfect. There's no form, there's no special form ever for the different moods in the perfect. In the imperfect, we have some verbs in the imperfect will take a special jussive form and be shortened, especially in the hiphil and in the third hey verbs. You'll have special forms. The cohortatives in first person often have a special form because they'll have a comets hey ending, or they'll have comets hey plus a na particle being utilized, but the perfects never have a marker to identify their mood. Their mood has to be designed and determined by context. So watch for that very carefully. He gets further into volitional forms on page 103 and following when he talks about jussives. Let's say that in your paper you have a verb, an imperfect, obviously, that you would identify as a jussive. What kind of jussive is it? He gives us three possibilities here on pages 104 to 105. I expect you to identify what kind of jussive that verb is. He says here that some jussives are a command or prohibition. Other jussives offer advice, and other jussives are requests or prayer. And if you go to Hebrew Bible Insert, Putnam also gives some examples of the uses of the jussive. And in your basic or your elementary Hebrew grammar that you use for first year Hebrew, you may also have some description of how jussives are used. Use all of those resources to help you identify how your particular jussive is being utilized. Imperatives. Imperatives can be used of command, and they can be used of advice, invitation or permission, request or prayer. 4 different uses given on pages 105 to 106. Yes, sir?
Is there places where the jussive is used and it's not really functioning as a jussive? That makes sense?
Well, first of all, if it's a jussive by form, there is a possibility that it might be shortened for other reasons by form rather than being an actual jussive. But all other jussive have to be identified by context, so there's no such thing as a verb being a jussive and not behaving as a jussive.
In my paper, I came to a jussive where it says, even though your sins are like the scarlet, and it's are like or become is like in the jussive form. And so I went to Chisholm and I was like, okay, the 3 options are request or prayer, advice, or command or prohibition. And I was like, I don't see how it says your sins become like. How is that a command, advice, or a prohibition?
Right. It's not any of those 3. But keep in mind that Chisholm has not given you all the list. There's also potentiality or possibility. There's permission. There's many other uses of the jussive than just what he's given us. All right? So what you need to do is go to Hebrew Bible Insert and look under the jussive and see the additional uses or check other grammars. Because there you have the idea of potentiality or possibility. Your sins might be as scarlet. Okay? All right? So you have to watch for those things. Don't rest on what Chisholm gives as exhaustive. Remember what he told us at the beginning? He said, I've only dealt with some of the more usual or more common usages that appear to have greater influence on exegesis. He's not given us an exhaustive list anywhere. And so rely on others to help you in that. Chisholm's a good start, and he gives some good illustrations of the ones he's talking about, but he's not exhaustive in his identifications. All right, so the same thing with imperatives. And then notice he deals with the concepts of volitional verbs in sequence on pages 108 and following. What do you have, or what's the usage or significance of having a jussive plus a jussive, or an imperative plus an imperative? And he goes through and talks about how some of these may be identical. They're synonymous, or they might be simultaneous, or they might be sequential. The second imperative can indicate result or consequence. The second imperative can indicate purpose. So if you have two imperatives in a row, ask yourself, how are those imperatives being used? Do they have that kind of relationship? And if so, then identify that. All right? And he also deals with two cohortatives or more in a row. All of these he goes through and talks about them. And then he gives an example of going through a complex sequence of volitional forms in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. And it's a very instructive example to read through and take a look at. When he comes to nouns, noun clauses on page 113 and following, he's talking about clauses where there are no verbs. They're non-verb clauses. They are called noun clauses. All the words in them are nouns, or the main words in them are nouns. And you have various uses of these noun clauses. You can have a nominative, you can have a genitive, you can have an accusative. And he gives the examples. You have relative clauses, temporal clauses, conditional clauses, concessive clauses, acceptive or restrictive clauses, comparative, causal, purpose, and result clauses. All of these go into other forms where he's getting into aspects that are not just noun clauses. And this is an area where there is some confusion in the way he's ordered these, because when you thought he's dealing with all noun clauses, his noun clauses start on 113 and end on 114. Remember, the greater category is dependent clauses in that heading at the top of page 113. So watch each of those. That means that if you have a verbal clause, then go ahead and look here at relative, temporal, conditional, concessive, acceptive, restrictive, comparative, causal, purpose, and result clauses. Some of these are induced by special particles. And that's why identifying the particles is so very important. Remember, the particles were one of those elements that we looked at with regard to what is exegetically significant. We got down to them, the miscellaneous macrosyntactical particles that you see up here on the screen. Those are very important to pay attention to. They will give you clues as to the types of clauses you're dealing with, whether they're restrictive, acceptive, conditional. All of those things will help you to identify. All right? Now that takes us through his discussion of areas that have to do with grammar in chapters 4 and 5. When you get beyond that, he gets beyond the sentence in chapter 6 in pages 119 and following. And there are several things here that you need to remember for your paper. Because although he gets out of the realm of syntax and starts to get into literary analysis and understanding, there are some elements here that are valuable to you in your paper, because some of you have poetry, some of you have narrative. And as you're looking at that, what are the elements of Hebrew narrative? He has three things that are identified for narrative. Number one, the narrative framework. Those are your wagik tol verbs. Number two, the non-standard constructions, where you have the framework still. You're dealing with the background information, the narrator, in how he's describing the events, but you change it to have a while plus non-verb followed by a perfect verb, for example. That's non-standard constructions. The third is quotations and dialogues that are embedded inside the narrative. Remember that the grammar within the dialogue is not related to or tied to the grammar outside the dialogue in the framework. Make sure you keep that straight. And then I want you to look at the non-standard constructions on page 123 and following. He gets into the while plus non-verb constructions, the disjunctive clauses on page 124. And notice how many different categories he gives. He gives the introductory use, the supplemental use, the circumstantial use. And by the way, the supplemental includes parenthetical, and he talks about the parenthetical about 1/3 down from the top of page 125. And then the circumstantial, the synchronic on page 126, the contrastive or the adversative, and then number 6, the dramatic or deictic, and number 7, concluding. So those are 7 different forms of disjunctive clause usage. So if you have a disjunctive clause, if you have a while plus a non-verb, you need to go and take a look at Chisholm. This is one of the areas where he has given more detail than most other grammars. Your elementary grammar will not have all 7 classifications of disjunctive clauses. Hebrew Bible Insert does not have all 7 classifications of disjunctive clauses. Chisholm does give that. So he's going to be extremely valuable to you if you have a while plus a non-verb in a sentence that has a verb, but the verb is not at the beginning where you normally expect to see it. Question?
Can I help but notice, like in a lot of these translations in page 124 to 125,
yes,
he uses the word now to translate the while.
Right, what he does, don't imitate.
Yeah. Is there like specific words that you would use to...
Never use now for any while conjunction. No now for while.
When I was looking at this for second Samuel, it wasn't that helpful because I couldn't use now. And
right.
I'm just wondering what other words you would use in these situations.
Well, in the disjunctive clauses, use either and, but, or nothing. It's that simple. And, but, or nothing for disjunctive clauses. Yes, sir?
I believe on page 127, in the concluding part of that, the while and non-verb, I think Chisholm, and I may be mistaken, Chisholm does use now for while in that example that he gives in the middle of page 127.
On page 127?
Yes, sir. Under
yeah, right.
including.
Judges 16:31?
Correct, he does use it. So that would be an
right, he uses it a number of times.
Okay.
That's not the only time. He uses it multiple times. I'm saying don't imitate.
Yes, sir. Just one.
Okay, for my class, for 603, 604 alone, what you do after that is fine with me, but in this class, no now for wow. Okay? No now for wow for now. Now, we can put together a number of rules if you want. Okay. Look at page 127 because there's something here that is brought out by Chisholm that helps you to understand some of what we're talking about with regard to exegetical significance. After that example in Judges 16:31, he says, as one can see from the preceding discussion, disjunctive clauses play an important role in narrative because they deviate from or interrupt the normal pattern in a narrative, which is Wayik-Tol sequence. They grab one's attention. So if you have a disjunctive clause, the writer is attempting to grab your attention. And if the writer is trying to grab your attention through that form in the Hebrew, then you have to catch that. You have to understand, okay, why is it so important that he grab my attention? You have to answer that question. Why did he grab my attention this way? What's so important about this that I need to pay attention to it? And you need to seek to identify that. And as you preach the text, then you've got to explain to your people why it was important to grab the reader's attention of the Hebrew text by the use of the disjunctive clause. He says the very structure of such clauses tends to highlight their content. For this reason, narrators can utilize this structure to heighten a story's dramatic dimension. And then he walks you through 2 Samuel chapter 11 to show you how their narrator uses disjunctive clauses to give you a contrast at the end of verse 1, where he has it underlined there at the right-hand side of the page. And then on page 128, the third line down in the Hebrew, underlined again, where he provides background information. And then before the end of it there, you see another underlined section, the disjunctive clause, where it is background information again. So by means of a contrast and 2 insertions of background information, the narrator is trying to catch the reader's attention to supply special information that must be paid attention to if we're going to rightly understand the event that he is describing. Now, one other issue here to deal with, and I do not know if you will run across this in your texts. I do not think so, but I want you to be aware of it, and I want you to read this section with care, and if for no other reason, then to be prepared for the final exam, which is not that far away, about 8 weeks away, right? We're almost halfway through the semester. On page 128, Chisholm has a category he calls the non-consecutive while plus the perfect. In other words, we are going to look at a wekatal form of the verb that is not a correlative perfect, or as he puts it, a consecutive perfect. It does occur. And it has a specialized usage. It is used for as an introductory pattern to start a section with. It can be used emphatically on page 129. It can be used to specify information on page 131. It can be used to fill up the meaning, to complement the meaning of another section on page 131. It can be consequential or climactic or concluding on pages 132 to 133. The key is on the top of page 130. There's where you want to spend some time, and we will be looking at this in detail in next class period 1 week from now. He gives 2 Kings 21, 2 through 6, and walks through the while plus perfect and shows how the narrator uses it for emphasis as he goes through. It is not the same as the wekatal of the what we look at as the correlative perfect. This is, and let me put it this way. When you have these two verbs, wayomer, wayomer. What's the difference between the two? What's the difference between the two? Anyone? The first one is a wayik-tol verb. Notice it has the wow with an A-class vowel, and it has a dogish in the prefix of the imperfect form. All right? That is a wayik-tol. That's found primarily in narrative. It is sequential in nature. Here's another wow plus another imperfect. These are both imperfects. In fact, both of these are cal imperfect third masculine singular. They're from the same root, amer. This wow and the construction is a wayik-tol form of the verb. This one is called wa-yik-tol. This is not a wow consecutive form of the verb. This is the wow consecutive imperfect. This is a simple imperfect with a wow. The same thing happens in the perfect, except in the perfect, you don't have a distinguishing mark like the A-class vowel in the wow and the dogish in the prefix letter of the imperfect. Because when you look at the wekatal, that is either a wow correlative, perfect, or it is a simple wow plus perfect. That tells you only context can tell you the difference. And next week I'll talk about the fact that there is a slightly different situation in some forms, not all forms, with a change of the accent pattern that helps to identify the non-wow correlative perfect as opposed to the wow correlative with perfect. Okay? But there are differences. And what he's done is try to highlight these and demonstrate them. And it shows again the complexity of the Hebrew language and the dependence the language has on context. Now I know this is your second year of Hebrew, and this is the first semester of your second year of Hebrew. And throwing a lot of complications into your path is not very encouraging. But let me just remind you that this is a real language. And as a real language, what do we know? Even about your own language. If you speak English as your basic language, or if you speak Chinese or Korean or Spanish or another language, what is characteristic of the language that you know best? It has a lot of nuances. It is complex. And it is very sophisticated. And it can have a huge variety of ways that you express things. And you can even say the same thing in 6 or 7 or more different ways. And that the emphasis you place on something will make a huge amount of difference. If I take the sentence, when will you start doing your next translation? And if I ask it, when will you start doing your next translation? That means something different than when will you start doing your next translation, right? Or when will you start, or when will you start doing, or when will you start doing your, or when will you start doing your next translation, or when will you start doing your next translation? Each of those has different implications and nuances. Some of those said a certain way are insulting, right? Some of those said a certain way are implying something that may not be true or may be true, either way. And each one of those, I mean, it's like that old phrase, when did you stop beating your wife? You know? When did you stop beating your wife? That means, oh, you really have been beating her, right? and you keep going on down. When did you stop beating your wife? Oh, that's because you beat your dog also. You see, that's everything why we emphasize. Now, when you look at it in the Hebrew, where do you get that kind of nuance in Hebrew? The accents bring out those nuances in Hebrew. They show where the emphasis is. They show where the pause is. They show where you must have to think about it. There are different ways of doing it. And also word order helps to bring out that emphasis. And we do the same thing in English. We change word order. We change word order to make a question. You did go to the store. Now, I could say that in a way that makes the question by the tone of voice. You did go to the store, right? But we don't always say, did you go to the store? We change the word order. These same things happen in Hebrew. Different things are said in different ways. It doesn't necessarily do that with questions, interrogatives. But it does have ways of saying things and giving signals and marking it. And so that's part of what we're trying to learn. But we're looking at a written language, no longer spoken by anyone in the world. Not even Israelis are speaking biblical Hebrew. They're speaking modern Hebrew. The grammar is totally different. No wayik-tol verbs. Very few wekatal verbs. Mainly participles being used for most verb tenses, verb forms in modern Hebrew. It's pronounced differently. Modern Hebrew has a totally different pronunciation than classical Hebrew. And so if you use modern Hebrew to pronounce biblical Hebrew, you can end up obscuring certain distinctions and differences within the language, and it obscures how the forms came about. And it doesn't help you understand why they are formed if you mispronounce it. And so as you're looking at all those things, it's so very different. There is no living biblical Hebrew speaker. And we live long after that time. So we're approaching a written text, and we're trying to figure out what the tone was, what possible gestures were given in the dialogue if they're not described or identified. And we're trying to identify what the time reference frame is. And that reference of time is determined by context or by certain phrases or particles in context, and never by the verb forms. So we have a huge task in front of us. And that's why on this paper, you will struggle more than on any other paper. It's also why on this paper, I'm more interested in you doing the work to the best of your ability and not reaching solid conclusions on every aspect of it. It's like with your translation. The preliminary translation, I'm not expecting perfection. It has to be really lousy to lose points. All right? On your syntactical analysis, I won't give it that way. I won't say it has to be really lousy to lose points. You can lose points by just being wrong, all right? But the point is, I'm not expecting perfection there either. I'm not grading you according to a standard perfection. I'm not taking the text that you have and looking at it and saying, okay, if they have 100% understanding of this text, they should have this, 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 and this, and then go through and measure you by that standard. I'm measuring it by a standard that you're at the beginning of second year Hebrew, and that you're attempting to approach this text for the first time in your life in great detail, and you have a whole year to spend with it, and you'll know it a lot better when you get to the end of this year than you will now. And so there's going to be some leeway, there's some flexibility, and there's some bend there. So just make certain that as you go through there, you keep that in mind and relax and enjoy it. Okay? But get into the details. Don't skip any word, don't skip any phrase. And ask those difficult questions. If this is a construct state, and if Putnam lists 18 different kinds of genitive, then which of those genitives do I have here? And you begin by the process of elimination. You look at the first one, say, nope, it's not what I have. Second one, nope, it's not what I have. Keep on going down. Maybe you find 3, and you say, well, those 3 are all possible, but I can't make up my mind which one fits best. Then don't make a choice. Just say that in your paper. These 3 seem to be the best for this particular construct state. I have yet to determine which one is best. And let it go. Move on. Okay? Everyone got that? Yes, sir.
Is there a plenary sense in the Hebrew that there's some people talk about in the Greek, where it's more the author meant more than one?
Plenary in what sense? More than one meaning, or more than one in the sense of number, where you have a collective singular meaning more than one? What do you mean?
Meaning.
More than one meaning? Yes. But you're not going to have that very often in the text you're dealing with.